It's lovely to welcome Professor Nguyen to the show. She is the Assistant Professor of History at the University of Alaska Southeast. And today we're discussing the manuscript which she's working on, titled Anti-War Transnationalism, People's Diplomacy in the Vietnam War. Nguyet, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I should like to ask first, how did you celebrate your Easter?
My Easter. I didn't do it, but my daughter and husband did. They had some fun hunting eggs and yeah,
Okay,
so
wonderful.
that was great. I
So
don't think professors have a lot of time
yeah,
for that.
yeah. I would say the same goes for students. I think Easter of this year is like the only time in weeks that I have like some free time.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's the end of the semester here too. How about you, where you are?
We are we're approaching the end of the semester, so it's going to be at the end of this month. Sorry,
End
next
of
month,
April, yeah.
May.
Yeah.
May. We're speaking in
End of
April.
May?
Yeah. We start
Oh,
the semester later than I think those in the US.
I see. Okay, yeah. Well, here in the US, we have two system. The semester system will start at the end of middle to end of August. And then we have the quarter system. I know that Oregon follows that, and they start at the end of September.
Okay, I see. So you have the honor of being the first Vietnamese guest on the show outside of my own family. So I'd like to ask about your personal as well as academic background.
Mm, sure.
Yes. This is where you describe your personal slash academic background.
Oh, well, what exactly should I focus on? Because, I have a long list. Um, would you like me to talk about how I ended up being in the States?
For starters, sure.
Yeah, I was teaching at the Academy for Journalism and Communication. Then I received well, of course, I applied and got a Fulbright scholarship to study communication at the University of Oregon. And by the end of my master's degree, I was thinking about what's next, and I was feeling as though I did not want to do a PhD in communication. It was not, you know, my cup of tea. And I realized that, the Vietnam War was always something that I was interested in, passionate about. Um, and so I applied, and I got a another scholarship to do my PhD at American University. Um, so I did.
Mhm. That's wonderful. So tell me about how and why the Vietnam War becomes a subject of your academic interests.
Mm. Yeah, I read somewhere long ago that if we are if we're good at something, like naturally good at something, is really not us. We choose to do that, but more like that thing chooses us. So I think it just I didn't do it on purpose. It was not like something that, someone had already, always told me that, no, this is what you should do. Um, Actually, I did a lot of things before that, researching the Vietnam War. I was a journalist. I went to the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. I thought I would become a diplomat. Um, I never thought I would be interested in history. I thought I would be a lawyer. Actually, I applied for the law school and I was accepted in Vietnam. Um, I thought I would be a physicist. I was really good at physics. I I worked for an NGO, a couple of NGOs. I worked for the press club at the Ministry of Culture. So I was an interpreter, a translator. I did so many things. And I never thought, never, well, I think I was trying to find what is it that I really want to do. And And so now that I'm doing this, and I realize that, oh, this is what I want to do, and that's why I'm sticking with it because it is a fulfilling and um mm, um makes me feel good. So that's a long way to answer your question. I did not choose to do the Vietnam War. I was basically stumbling upon it and then was stuck with it. I guess, I just then I stayed with it because yeah, I realized, oh, this is what I've been wanting to do. So that's the long way to answer your question. The short answer is that when I came to this country, for some reason I kept talking about the Vietnam War, and then I got triggered very easily, um, and passionately, whenever people would say things that would contradict what I believed in, and I was very perplexed and disturbed, and sometimes I was mad. There was a person who was I'm very passionate, or I like play badminton, and there's this badminton player who's an American. And one day I was getting along with him and everything. But one day we were talking about somehow the Vietnam War came up and he said, I hate that war. And so I looked at him and I asked, why? At the time I thought I was expecting him to say things like, well, that war was brutal, that was wrong. If not that war was wrong, at least he would have, I was expecting him to say something like, well, it killed so many people, it was bad this way and bad that way. And he was just saying nonchalantly, because we lost. And I was so mad, I stopped talking to him. I don't know, for a few weeks because I could not fathom someone would say something like that about such a horrific event. And I didn't know what to do with the whole thing, so I just stopped talking to him. And I didn't even know why I was upset. I didn't even think about it. That's one example. The other one was when I was on a Fulbright scholarship, and Fulbright gave us a seminar. Basically, they sent us to different families in the States just to stay for a few days. We went to Philadelphia to visit, where all the historical sites with historical significance were in Pennsylvania. So I stayed with a Jewish lawyer family. Both of them were Jewish. They were both lawyers. And the husbands one day took me around town, um, showing things around town, and I remember he was saying somehow, again, the Vietnam War all the time. Somehow the topic of the Vietnam War came up. John McCain. I was sitting in the back seat. I think his wife was sitting in the front seat. I was sitting back there, and he was saying, he was commenting about John McCain, that if John McCain could forgive the Vietnamese, anyone could. And my jaw just dropped. Literally, I looked at the rear view mirror and I saw myself doing this. And I think he saw that and he corrected himself. He said something like, well, if anyone could forgive anybody in that war. So things like that. at the beginning, for 2 years of my master's degree, things like that happened um regularly. And I realized two things. One is I had been trained to look at the Vietnam War in one specific way. The other one was I really don't know I didn't know how to respond to those comments. And that's related to the first one because I was trained in um in a specific way. So I thought that I think I want to know more. I when I went to the diplomatic academy of Vietnam, we had to go through a lot of history classes. And I really wanted I at the time when I was there as a college student, I was thinking about the world a lot, how nations interacted with one another, how policy was made, especially foreign policy that could impact millions of lives at the same time. So as I pondered upon doing my PhD or what's next after the master's degree, I thought, okay, that I'm going to do that. I want to know. I really want to know what I should say, why I reacted the way I did, and what I should say in those circumstances.
Understood.
And
Yeah.
now I am doing it full time.
Mhm. Yes. Of course, us being Vietnamese, I think the war has to have some personal resonance with us.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
I think I've been asked about the Vietnam War a lot while I was studying in college,
In
sometimes
Europe.
by Americans. And the way I see it, I've always been taught a chronicle, according to the Vietnamese side of what happened. And um, increasingly, I find it doubtful. I do not believe that that story, so straightforward as it is the story, so to speak. So I think that's why my interest in diving into what really happened in the process that leads up to the war, as well as the war itself, I find to be
Mm.
quite important. And of course,
Mm. That's true.
that's where
Yeah.
I that's when I get to talk to you. So I should say
Hmm.
that one Mark Pavlik introduced me to you.
Yeah. Mhm.
He also sent me a manuscript of sorry, a book of essays about American actions in Southeast Asia
Yeah.
and
I use
everything.
that book in my class. Yes.
Wonderful. Yes. So how did you get to know Mark, first of all?
Oh yeah. I was that was I went to a conference at the time I was doing my postdoc at American University, and I went to a conference in November of 2019. And that's where I met him. Supposedly, I don't even remember. I only remember going there. I remember meeting a lot of people. I don't remember who exactly. I remember making a comment at that conference, and I think it must have made an impression on him. So when I returned home, he contacted me and said, I met you at the conference. I would like to send you a book. So
Mhm.
he sent me his book. And it started from there. And he has been more than, way more than gracious. So kind, so helpful. He helped me with my book manuscript, still helping me. So yeah, I'm indebted to Mark.
So I haven't met Mark in person, but he got to know me because in one of these podcast episodes, I had a chance to talk to Professor Noam Chomsky of MIT,
Yeah,
of course,
yes.
and it's to this day I'm still like really surprised that he would agree to talk to me and
Me
talk to me
too.
for
Noam
for this.
Chomsky would talk to me.
Yeah,
He's legendary and he's
yes, of
so
course.
humble, so approachable.
Yeah.
Yeah, I Yeah,
Mhm.
definitely. Yeah.
Now, before we get to talk to the manuscript, so aside from being the first Vietnamese person, obviously outside of my family that I talked to, you're also the first person living in Alaska that I'm talking to,
Mm,
and
yeah.
I think it's yeah, is a curiosity because I know that most Vietnamese people who are living in America, they live in either the West Coast or the East Coast. So, New York or
Somewhere hot.
California because of the weather. I think
Yeah.
Arizona too,
Yeah.
and Louisiana, I've heard. But, you know, uh, a Vietnamese in Alaska, that has to be a story in and of itself. So do tell me that story.
Well, I go where the job is. So I didn't have to come to Alaska for sure. Or I mean Juneau. Juneau more than, Juneau is very different from the rest of Alaska, by the
I see.
way. It's a lot warmer.
Hmm.
It's a lot rainier.
Hmm.
It's actually lower than half of Canada, lower as in
Yeah.
lower in latitude. So it's not as gruesomely cold as you would think of Alaska.
Mhm.
Uh, I didn't have to come here. I was doing my postdoc in Ohio and I had one more year. So I was like just at the beginning of my first year when I applied. Um, but when I came to do my interview, everything in this place spoke to me. I, for example, I just met the librarian. I went with the librarian 2 days ago to go pick some pussy willows, the flowers. I remember when I came to, I just told her that, this is what I saw when I came for the interview. I saw you in the library and I saw all the flower arrangements from just bushes around you in the library, and I really loved it. And I saw all the artifacts made by Native Americans through campus, through the city. I went in the building where my current office is, and I saw the architecture, the use of wood. Um, I just thought, well, I don't know, I felt home. It was cold when I came, but it was sunny, very rarely sunny here. I just felt like home, so I stayed. I thought, oh, I can be here. And also, people are very laid back. I am someone who's perpetually anxious, a total perfectionist. I am very, very harsh on myself. So, um, so to be in an environment where people are accepting and easy, would make it easier on me. That's my calculation anyway. I thought I could try to be at a bigger university somewhere more central. But then I don't like competition. Actually, I do like competition, and that's bad for me. Um, Maybe I can just compete with myself where there's not a lot of, harsh competition. And then the workplace seemed very congenial and friendly. Um, and they loved me. They really liked me. I think there were like over 100 applicants uh, in my um, for my position. So so I thought, oh, I can be here, and I think I made the right decision.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'd like to talk about your manuscript now, and I certainly would welcome you when your manuscript is done and published. We've mentioned the title already. Um, so the subject is People's Diplomacy. That is a proper name that refers to an agency in the Vietnam War. So tell
Mhm.
me more about that and what is your topic research.
Yeah, I'm not going to give you the 2-minute elevator pitch. Usually people work out like that short version. The longer version is that when I went to the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, I remember being very surprised and struck by this notion of people's diplomacy. It was taught to us over and over and over. This is what we did. This is how we succeeded. This is why we did what we did. And it is the kind of effect that it had in the world. And I took it at face value because they taught us everything at face value. Um, there was not a lot of evidence to it. There was not a lot of analysis to it. We were just told that this is what we did, but very generically, even though we were told like years after, after years. Um, and so when I decided to do my PhD, first of all, I decided to do my PhD about the Vietnam War. And then when it comes to like, okay, what exactly about the Vietnam War do you want to do? That's the question for every PhD students. And I said, I want to do people's diplomacy. I want to know. I want to know whether what we were taught. I know that it was true, but to what extent was it true? If it was true, how was it true? What kind of evidence did they use? Was there anything else there? I want to know more about it. I was told, point blank, very generically, that this is what it was. And so I want to know more about it. And I know that after being in the States for that long, I know that nobody had done anything like that up to that point about people's diplomacy in Vietnam. So I floated the idea to my advisor, and he said, "Sure, go for it." So I did. The idea of people's diplomacy, according to the version that I was taught in Vietnam, was that the DRV, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, meaning North Vietnam, was conducting this elaborated, effective campaign to basically start the global anti-war movement, and succeeded in isolating and shaming the United States in the global stage, and succeeding in alter the course of the war and ending the war, forcing the U.S. to, you know, do certain things. That's the official version of it. So I decided to do, okay, why don't we start with the official version first? Meaning, what did Hanoi do? Then I wanted to know, okay, did that work in the States? So I chose the US as the second location. And then I chose the third location, which is France, because I thought France was one of the closest allies of the States. And I know that the anti-war movement in France was really, really strong. So if the anti-war movements in France were strong, like one of the closest allies in the state of the states, and the anti-war movements in France was strong, then of course it makes sense that it would be strong somewhere else. Of course, in the Eastern Bloc, that would be a given. I'm sure that there are other places like in Africa and some other non-aligned Asian countries that it would deserve another book. But for me, it was the U.S., France, and Vietnam. And if I can make a case by using 3 locations, then I have a topic.
I see. Okay. So I'd like to ask about the third location, which is France. So why do you believe that the anti-Vietnam War movement was so strong there?
Why did I believe? I didn't. I was told. So I went and tried to find out why. So the reason was that the France by that point was the home of the largest Vietnamese diaspora
Yes.
in the world. And the Vietnamese diaspora in France was just not just a not a what I would say a usual group of people. They were very nationalistic, very anti-colonial a group of people. So so it was only almost a natural course of action that they would be anti-war. I'm not saying that they would be pro Hanoi. I'm saying that they would be anti-war. They would want Vietnam to be unified and independent and peaceful for sure.
Mhm. Yes. Now the way I read it is that the president of France, de Gaulle, was against sending troops to Hanoi, so he was defying U.S. policy at that time. And I suppose the
Okay,
reason,
okay. Let me can you clarify? He was against sending whose troop? The
uh,
French troop or the
yeah,
American troop?
French,
Oh,
of course. Well, he is not the president of America, so he cannot, he cannot dictate American troops. But yeah, de Gaulle was against sending French troops to Vietnam. He was defying American policy at that time, and I suppose the reason why is that France was the colonial power of Indochina and Vietnam, and 1954 saw the extrication of French troops, and he didn't want to get involved again.
okay. So when you say de Gaulle didn't want to send French troops to
Yeah.
Vietnam, you mean that was in 1965 when the States sent troops to
Yes.
Vietnam?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Just want to
Um,
clarify.
of course. Yeah. So I believe that is the reason, but nevertheless, the anti-Vietnam protests. I'm thinking the one in 1968. The May 5th movement.
May 1968, yeah.
Yes, the May 1968 movement still went on, and it went on with such intensity and fervor. And I wonder, yeah, for the
So
British, why is it
when
so?
you said that,
Yeah.
okay, sorry, I got to make some notes here.
Okay.
Um, so you have a question, or would you like me to comment on what you said?
Yeah, I'm very curious as to, even though France was officially against, sending troops to Vietnam, why is it that the French anti-Vietnam War movement, not just within the Vietnamese, but of the French society as a whole, is still like
Mhm.
of such intensity?
Okay, so here's what something for context.
Yeah.
France was not the only country that refused helping the Americans in Vietnam. So of all the allies that the US had at the time of the end of 1964, the beginning of 1965, when Johnson LBJ decided to send ground troops to Vietnam, the US had one ally
Yeah.
that supported the US. Of all the allies, only one, which was Australia.
Mm.
Australia was the only country that sent troops to Vietnam and paid for its own troops. We have the South Koreans, we have the Filipinos, um, we have the Thais. Those were mercenaries.
Mhm.
They were paid by the states to fight in Vietnam. Australia was the only one country. So France, in that sense, was not an unusual case, yeah,
Mhm.
not to send
Okay.
troops to Vietnam. And by 1965, no way that France would do it because de Gaulle in 1964 already, actually at the end of 1963, and throughout 1964, de Gaulle had been very vocal against the way Americans were conducting themselves in
Mm.
Vietnam. I think the reason for what de Gaulle was doing was various, not there was not only one. You know, you talked about de Gaulle didn't not wanting to recommit
Yeah.
troops in Vietnam because he had just pulled the troops out and so on. Well, France at the time, the Algerian War just ended,
Hmm.
and you know, just a couple of years later, no, there's no way France was in no way, shape, or form willing to go through that trauma again. It was so shamed by the international community during the Algerian War. And so, even though it didn't lose militarily in Algeria, it had to stop the war based on diplomacy. I mean, based on shame. And I think the Vietnamese saw that too, and they were inspired by what happened in Nigeria. So, so that's one reason. The other reason is de Gaulle was very much for France, you know, the great France, and he wanted to conduct a foreign policy for France that is was independent from U.S. Foreign policy, and he was just you know, don't forget France used to be an empire and had having you know, a voice in the international arena. So he wanted that again for France. And that's another reason why he, you know, seemingly challenged US Vietnam policy. And the third reason was he was genuinely worried about the widening war in Southeast Asia and you know the nuclear specter of it and all the you know consequences. And the fourth reason is he was truly worried for the US. He was genuinely wanting to help his ally, saying that you know we had 80 years in Vietnam, we had a lot of experience there, we understand the Vietnamese, we have so many contacts with the Vietnamese both in France and in Vietnam. We know how they're thinking. So don't go there. So there are many, many reasons why de Gaulle did what he did. Now, back to the anti-war movement in France. The anti-war movements in France uh, were really strong, not because, so you seem to suggest that, okay, France already agreed not to be involved. How
Yeah.
come people were still protesting? Well,
Yeah.
they were not protesting. They were not protesting France. They were protesting the US
Hmm.
in Vietnam. And the reason, part of the reason why, well, especially at the beginning, right after 1956, when the election didn't happen, then up to 1959, when Dong Khởi happened.
Yeah.
And then, you know, the war just kept escalating and escalating. But at the beginning, for several years, the Vietnamese really held France accountable because France was the one that signed the Geneva Accords that promised that we guarantee that this is going to happen. Now, I went to the archives in France and I saw a lot of communication between Hanoi and Paris. And the Vietnamese were saying, you signed it. You said you would do something. You said you would do this. You said you would do that. You said all these things. You signed it. Why are you not doing it? Why are you supporting the US in propping up Nguyen? Why are you not challenging, you know, what is going on in South Vietnam? Why are you not coming out and protest the election, the cancellation of the election and everything? So they would use the leverage. At the beginning, the Vietnamese, I mean North Vietnam, would not have a lot of leverage. The I think the only leverage that they had was some economic interest, especially the coal in Quảng Ninh province, where I was born. And the Vietnamese would say, "You would not, we will not give you, would not make concessions." You know, the French would want to come back, would want to recoup some of the things, you know, economic benefits in North Vietnam, and would want to do this, want to do that, especially in the cultural realm. You know, like all the scientific, cultural. cooperation. They wanted to do so and so. But the Vietnamese, the Hanoi would say, "Well, you did not recognize us. You are recognizing the Saigon government. You are doing the American bidding. So we are not going to cooperate with you because you're not holding your own end of the bargain." And so that is to explain to you why the Vietnamese in France were still protesting, were still trying to get the French government to do what it promised to do. And then they used, again, being inspired by what happened in Algeria, they tried to replicate the same thing. They tried to make a big deal in the court of world opinion to try to shame the US. So there were a lot of moving pieces there. And Paris and France being the central country in Europe, and the home of many of the media, one of the biggest media centers in the world, the Vietnamese would not give up the fight. They would make a big would make a lot of noises in France, because they knew that if they could make any noises at all for the world to see, that would be France. So they, would send delegations there. They would send victims there. They would, fund various, NGOs or organizations. They would do a lot of things in France. But I'm getting into like a more, of the nuts and bolts of what they did in France. I don't know if that's what you want to say or to know.
I think that's an understandable answer. Yes, so you mentioned the regime of Saigon, and we are talking now on the 26th of April, so the 30th is remembered
Yeah.
locally. In the US is remembered as the fall of Saigon, but in
Mhm.
Vietnam, where I was born and raised, in Hanoi, I was born in
Mhm.
Hanoi actually, and I lived there
Mm.
for a good number of my life. Um, it is now still a national holiday, and it's called Reunification Day, when the North took back the South,
Mhm.
and I think this is the contention every year where I have to face this, whether it was a legitimate reunification of the North and the South, so two people
Mm.
become one, so to speak, or
Mm.
is it the case that the North annexed the South? So
Mm. Who
from
said
your
that? Who said that it was the North annexed the South?
now, well, I guess
So where you are, whenever it was April the 30th, would you encounter people who say, or do you encounter people who say this is the North Vietnam invading South Vietnam and annexing South Vietnam? Or is
um,
that a hypothetical question? That's what I mean.
I think if you are a Vietnamese Southerner, and I've encountered plenty of those,
Mhm.
in my travels,
Mhm.
they would say that, well, it is a case of an invasion and annexation.
Mm, I see. Well, I have not, certainly I have come across people like that, but very few, very, very few. I make the case of the US losing in Vietnam because they did not understand that the majority, the vast, vast, vast majority of Vietnamese think of Vietnam as one country. They may think that, yes, the North has a different regime or system, the South has a different system, and the system in the North invaded the system in the South. Then, yes, there's a case to be made.
Mhm.
But very few people would say that Vietnam is actually two countries. That's that. And whereas the US thought that because it could do that in Korea, it could do the same in Vietnam. Actually, there's evidence in the cabinet thinking that way. Why could they be like the damn Koreans? Yeah. Why could they not accept that as the Koreans did? And the Vietnamese, the vast, it doesn't matter. I've talked to many and I've read plenty. It doesn't matter if you're northerners or southerners. It's very hard to convince a Vietnamese, a normal, usual, normie Vietnamese, that Vietnam is two countries. Yeah, you can convince that, yeah, okay, well, we don't like communists and now the communists took over. But I think what you're trying to get at is the arguments. One side is whether the key word is not reunification. Reunification means two halves became one.
Yeah.
That that people, I don't think people have problems with that. What they have problem with is the word independence.
Hmm.
Hanoi often use, that word independence. Like 1975, we finally, repelled the foreign invaders, and we achieved our independence. We defeated the imperialist, and we achieved independence. Then many Southerners would say, well, not really. You may think you got your independence. We lost our independence. So that I can see where the contention can be. But unification, reunification, I don't think you will find a lot. You may come across one or two here and there who thought that I just want South Vietnam to be one country, and Northerners, you stay where you are, don't come down here. Is a very hard sell for many Vietnamese. Remember, we just had in 1954 close to 2 million people migrating from the north to the south. For a country of less than 30 million people, from the north to the very south, that is a huge, huge number of refugees. And in 1956, when Diem assumed power, and the U.S. tried to sell that idea, the idea that there are two separate countries, North Vietnam and South Vietnam, to even the South Vietnamese, that's really, really hard to sell. And the problem with here's the problem I'm telling you. The problem with the US is not only that, but also similar with Taiwan. That Diem and his cabinet members and his government also thought that they are, or they were, the legitimate representative of the entire Vietnam. So while the U.S. wanted Diem to be content with just South Vietnam, they never thought of themselves as just their agenda. What they want is the entire Vietnam. What they want is to represent the entire Vietnam, the state of Vietnam that they inherited they thought they inherited from the Bao Dai government and backed by the French. So either side, I mean, officially, either side, northern or southern, they all thought that Vietnam was one. They just wanted they wanted their system to be the system of the entire country, not that they thought of Vietnam as two countries, separate countries. And a side note, that was also a problem with Taiwan. When the US backed Taiwan, the US wanted Taiwan to be happy on that island. The Taiwanese, why can't you just be happy here? You have your own, country here. But the Chinese, the Chiang Kai-shek government, they thought, no, we represent the entire China. If you fly Eva Air, for example, I had that cognitive dissonance one time. I flew through Taiwan, Taipei, and I saw, the history that they have had an exhibit in Taipei about the Chinese postal system.
Hmm.
And I thought, why did they not say Taiwanese? Why did they say Chinese? And then I did not know. I was ignorant. And I found it really curious. And then I talked to a historian in my department, and he said, yeah, the Taiwanese, they always thought of themselves as being representing the entire China, not just Taiwan. So same with Vietnam, not that we think that we are two different countries, um, um, but one prevailed, the system of one prevailed against the other system. I hope that I made that clear. I
Yeah,
hope that
I,
makes
I,
sense.
I understand. Yes. And I guess like you, I've also flown Ava Air. I've landed in Taipei a few times. Sometimes I got
Yeah,
like stuck in there because of the delay in flights. But yeah, I would really love to like travel to that place more and spend more time there. Never.
yeah.
Yeah.
So the history of Taiwan is fascinating because it was also a colony of Japan,
Hmm.
in the 19th century. And I learned so much. And now I teach world history as well, and then I teach China history. So I had a chance to brush up on all of my, general knowledge. Now, what you mentioned at the beginning, when we talk about history, we talk about what happened. I think that was a very, very important, like the uh, um, the conditional, or no, what is the essential step to understand the next. That is, if we have to agree upon, like, fact, just what happened, yeah. Then, after we have agreed upon what happened, then we can debate the interpretations of what happened. Oh, you can look at it from this angle, that angle, and so on. But first, we need to agree, like, okay, this is what happens. You can't tell me that the sky is red when it is blue. If we can both agree that the sky is blue and when it's raining, it's wet, then we can talk about the next, step of our historical inquiry.
Okay. Now, I think without being a partisan to either the North, the Hanoi regime, or the Saigon regime, I would say that the Cold War saw a lot of partition of nations. You've already
Mm,
mentioned China and Korea, but I would say Germany went through the same fate. And
mhm.
I'm sure that the at that time both the West German and the East Germans saw themselves as well Germans, and
Exactly. Yeah. They
and
never,
yeah,
and I think the case of Korea is pretty much the most tragic one because it's still
yeah.
divided.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
and then of course, some historians, I know some, actually, I know some, would take the issue with what I said, as Vietnam as one country and is always one country, and people think of it as one country and so on. And some would say, well, how dare you? Because there are this group of people and that group of people. Yeah, and I acknowledge that, that Vietnam was. How far back do we want to go? If you want to go that far back, actually, no country is one, right? We were all made up of, immigrants or migrants and refugees from different places. And if you go way back, it would be different tribes. And how do you know? Do you want to say that because there were like 10 tribes in around the Hanoi River Delta, then that means there were 10 nations there? How do you want to go back? But what I'm saying is that, um, collectively, by the account of the mainstream Vietnamese, then Vietnam was conceived or be perceived by the majority of the mainstream Vietnamese as one nation. I don't want to talk, no, to discount the fact that, Vietnam did spread, did expand, and did annex different, tribes
Yeah.
or even kingdoms, as it, expanded in the north and then went south. along the Cheongshan Mountains, and wiped out other smaller kingdoms or city states along the way. That's not what I meant. But fast forward to the Vietnam War or the Vietnamese American War. Um, then yeah, most Vietnamese, normie Vietnamese, would think of Vietnam as a one country.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with that. I would reject any like notion that says that there are two so to speak Vietnams. I just thought of it as a country divided, and I think
Hmm.
that's the most tragic part of the war, that I don't think either Americans or Vietnamese talk about enough. But I think at least for the Vietnamese of the generation that precedes me, one or two generations before me, is that there's still this animosity that, say, Southerners have against Northerners, and you can
Hmm.
tell, a Northerner from a Southerner, Vietnamese, I suppose, by their accents. I've encountered directly people who would not talk to me because I speak in a Northern accent.
Exactly. Me too.
Yeah.
Me too. Plenty. And I always, people here, Americans would ask me how I would deal with that. And I thought, well, if I were someone like them, I can understand why they act the way they act. It doesn't mean that they are right. I'm not condoning their action. I think they were wrong to have worked for the other side and then got expelled out of the country. But I could understand why they did what they did. They if I were, I often talk about like how much money they would make by working for the Americans. Yeah, you are on top of the food chain by working for them. You received lavish payments, benefiting not just you but the entire extended family. And then the war ended, and you felt. I'm talking about like the majority of them who fled. I'm not talking about some people. Of course, the CIA would have like a terror campaign to scare people, and a lot of people maybe a seamstress or a tailor or what is that called? A driver, who would drive Americans around and would be associated with Americans in a very, very minor ways. But then got really spooked, really scared because of the CIA campaign of a bloodbath if the communists came, and then somehow they just fled because they were scared. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about those who really worked for the other side. And then of course they lived lavishly in there, when the rest of us were being bombed or starved to death or so on. And um and then they lost all that. The war came to an end, and they had to leave the country, and they became refugees. And then now, instead of having, house servants, they would have to clean the toilets, yeah, or to pack groceries for customers, and become really working class people. And they would, if I were them, I would be pretty mad, you know. I would be mad. Um, so I can understand why they think the way they think, but it doesn't make it right.
I've also read stories about like around the same time as the fall of Saigon or reunification, depending on how you call it. The nation of Iran undergo a regime change where the Shah fell, and
Mm.
the
That
Ayatollah.
was 1979, though.
Yes.
That's 20
So
years after.
I around the same decade. So yeah, 4 years
Yeah,
later.
exactly.
And
Hmm.
there are stories about like how people who either work in the regime or were residents of that regime when they were displaced, and
Mm.
they find refuge in Western countries, and they find their positions being like very diminished. I think
Yeah,
there's this novel, House of Sand and Fog, that depicts such a life.
really. Yeah, I sympathize with them, but if they could not get out of their bubble to see, you know. I mean, in Vietnamese, we have that saying, what, cờ đến tay ai người ấy phất, đúng không?
Yes, yes.
Uh,
Um,
yeah, so they were riding the waves. At the time, it was behind them. It was like they were, capitalizing on the system at the time, and the system collapsed. Well, then that's just life. You win some, you lose some.
mhm,
Um, I still think I don't want to make a. Of course, I can make a moral judgment about why they did what they about what they did, but I don't want to. I just thought that from a purely historical perspective, what happened to them is life, tough luck. Sorry,
mhm.
you know.
Yeah, I should also clarify that the Vietnamese saying that you've just mentioned. I believe the rough American English translation is something like, you made your bed, now lie in it, or something like that.
You're like,
Yeah, I suppose
yeah.
that's the closest way I can translate it. But
Yeah,
I
or
think
you reap
yeah,
what you sow, but
sure, yeah,
but
yeah.
then it's it sounds harsher than what the other one. Let me try to think of the English equivalent of "cờ đến tay ai người ấy phất." It's almost more like
Yeah, I suppose the literal English translation is when whose hand touches the flag, they wave it.
yeah, yeah, that is, yeah, you are on top. You you grab it. You were the one who grabbed it, and you were
Yeah.
charging forward because you have the flag, and now you so they did grab that flag, and they did ride it, and then things change, and that's unfortunate. I remember when I was at the restaurant in 2007. I just came to the country, and the host family took me out to a Vietnamese restaurant, and I needed a spoon or something, or a fork, I don't remember. Um, and I spoke to the waitress in English, and the host family told me, "Come on, just speak in Vietnamese." And I said, "Well, I have I don't want to fake a southern accent. I have a northern accent." And they said, "Oh, come on, it's 40 years already. Why?" And I said, "No, I don't want to reveal it." And they said, "Come on, you can do that." And they kept, prodding and prodding. And so I'm like, "Okay, sure." So she came over, and I started speaking to her in Vietnamese. And she just glared at me like this
Oh wow.
and just walked away.
Oh wow. Okay.
And my hosts were stunned. They were like, "Holy cow, it really exists, didn't it?" And I said, I told you so. I don't want to speak with a northern accent when I don't know who they were and what they were thinking. Um, because I just don't want to bother with it. Why bother?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I know that personally, I before living in Hungary, I lived in Austria for a year, and I went to
Mm.
the Vietnamese church there, and because of the fact that many of the church fellows were Southerners, and yeah, I'm from the North, I remember that half of them wouldn't speak to me, or
Oh,
more than that,
wow.
even. Like I say, two-thirds.
Did it change over time, or it stayed after until you left?
I think more people started talking to me.
Huh?
But I don't think it reaches any more than a third of the congregation is.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's unfortunate. And again, I mean, and at the end of the day, I often think that, well, it's their loss, not ours. If hatred is what you want to keep in your heart, um, then by all means.
Mhm. Okay. So I'd like to end on this final note. I wonder in your research, how would you characterize the perception of say a typical North Vietnamese towards the South and also vice versa, the South Vietnamese towards the North? Is it the case that
Mm,
yeah.
you mean like within the context of the Vietnam War, or
Yeah, yeah.
general perception?
There's this phrase, right? In Vietnamese, Minh Nguy, which is like
Oh,
American
I see what you're
Nguy.
saying.
So it
Ah,
implies that the South Vietnamese are collaborators of to the
mm,
the empire, so to speak. It's almost
mm,
like in France you have the Vichy regime,
yeah,
and
yeah.
the rest of
The Vichy.
Free France sees that as Nazi collaborators, and I
Mm,
presume that's the same if
mm,
as the North being the South. And I suppose
mm,
for the South, the typical view is that the North are hopeless communists, and
mm,
communism is an evil. So I
mm.
wonder what is your insight on that?
It's very hard. Okay, let's talk about the North first.
Mhm.
The general perception in the North is easier to control because, during the war, there was one party. Everyone was consuming the same type of information. So the um, the perception of South Vietnam or the South Vietnamese government as lackeys was easy to develop. You just kept repeating the same message over and over, then it will go through. Whereas in the South, it's really hard because don't forget we have our own allies in the South, the National Liberation Front.
Yeah.
So those in the NLF and those who were sympathizers of the NLF would not think of the North as an invading force. Actually, they would think of the North as our allies, and we are going to reunify the country under one system and regime and so on. And then you would have the third force, people who did not like communism and did not like the Saigon government either. Um, and they would try to thread the needle and try to come to a neutral position. And I think people should write a few books about this third force. And then you have hardcore Saigon regime people who would definitely, in the heart of heart, they thought of communism as evil, and they believed it, and there were those who died for that cause, you know. Um,
Yeah.
and then there would be those who were, opportunistic, well, I guess in a war, um, uh, I need to choose a side, and I think the other side gives me more. So they are not ideological. They just try to survive, and
Mhm.
they chose the other side. Then so in the South, it's a lot harder to categorize, like to make a generalized observation about how they viewed the North or Northerners, whereas in the North it was easier. Nowadays the government of Vietnam has made a lot of concerted effort to change the perception of the South or the Saigon regime. They discouraged the use of the word lackey, partly because they really tried to reconcile, right? Reconciliation, of the former enemies, not only between North and South and different factions within the country, but also between the U.S. and Vietnam. So I think again, there's only one party in Vietnam. So this kind of change in our perception is easier to be implemented in Vietnam, and I think it doesn't take much, it doesn't take long for that to really seep in the entire Vietnam.
Mhm. Of course, as I've mentioned, we'll continue this conversation when your manuscript is done and published. So I hope for the best in that process.
All right, thank you so much for having me here today, and I wish you the best of luck with whatever you're doing.
Oh, thank you very
And
much.
thank you again for having me.